In this short video, I'd like to show you how to use the TI-84 calculator to perform basic hypothesis testing. Over on the left, we see that the null hypothesis is that the mean is equal to 62, and the alternative hypothesis is that the mean is greater than 62. Because the alternative hypothesis has a greater than sign, we know that this test will involve a right tail test. The sample size is 15, and the mean of the sample is 64. The sample standard deviation is 3.4. We'll use a confidence level of 95%, which means that alpha, the level of significance, is 5%. Now remember, because this is a right tail test, the 5% will be the area in the right tail of the distribution. Below the dotted line, I've done some calculations that I don't have to do, but I've included them for clarity in the presentation. And we can compare these numbers to the results we get from the calculator. Here you see that I've calculated the critical value for the 95% confidence level and 14 degrees of freedom. And I'm using the inverse t function in the calculator. And this gives us a critical value of 1.761. I've also calculated the test statistic using our standard formula, and you see I've substituted the sample mean, the mean from the hypothesis, the sample standard deviation, and the square root of the sample size, and this gives us 2.278. Now we're doing a t-test because the sample size is relatively small, just 15. And we also don't know what the population standard deviation is. So with these numbers in mind, let's go to the calculator and see how to perform the test. By the way, we already know from these manual calculations down here that the test statistic 2.278 is greater than the critical value. So our test statistic does fall into the rejection zone. And so we already know that we're going to reject the null hypothesis. But we want to see how the numbers in the calculator would tell us to reject the null hypothesis. So on the calculator, we'll begin by pressing the Stat button. That brings up our usual statistics menu. And this time we want to use the Tests option. So let's scroll over to Tests. And the test I want to use this time is the t-test, number 2. So I'll press 2. And here we have the t-test input screen. Now notice I have two options here. One is data and one is stats. I only use data if I have the raw data and I've put that data into the L1 list. That's not the case this time. So I want to use the stats option and just enter the summative statistics. So I'll go over to stats, press enter, and now you see the screen display changes, and now I can enter my statistics. So let's go down to mu naught, or mu sub 0, that's 62. The sample mean was 64. The sample standard deviation was 3.4. And the sample size was 15. Now on this line you have to be very careful. The option you want to select here has to express what the alternative hypothesis says, which is greater than. So that's this option here. So let's scroll over, and then once we focus on that option, press enter. That completes our input. We're now ready to calculate, so let's come down to calculate and press enter. And let's look at the results. Well, first of all, we see that we have the t-test statistic 2.278. That agrees with the one I manually calculated over here. And then more importantly, we have this p-value, which is 1.9%. Now remember, the thing about the p-value is that if the p-value is less than alpha, which is 5%, then we must reject the null hypothesis. So 1.9% is less than 5%, so that tells us to reject the null hypothesis. So we're rejecting the hypothesis that the mean is equal to 62. So the data supports the claim that the mean is greater than 62. So I hope this short video clarified how to use the calculator to perform basic hypothesis testing.